following podcast is for informational purposes only. The contents of this podcast do not constitute tax, legal, or investment advice. Take responsibility for your own decisions, consult with the proper professionals, and do your own research.
And that is probably the part that I am most impressed with. It's whether we're talking indexers, core devs, other foundation members, there's just so much talent in there and so much dedication to the graph. It is amazing to see, and it's amazing to be part of that process.
We're like astronauts floating in the space of time.
Welcome to the GRTIQ podcast. Today I'm speaking with Oliver Zerhusen, Ecosystem Manager at the Graph Foundation. Oliver has been an active participant in the Graph community for a long time, but since he has joined the Graph Foundation, his contributions have become more visible and substantial, whether it's leading a community call or a community initiative. My conversation with Oliver spans his entry into the Graph community, his professional background as an executive outside the crypto space, his role at the Graph Foundation, and his recent publication of a post in the Graph Forum on the topic of keeping stake decentralized. We started the conversation talking about Oliver's educational and non-technical entry into the crypto space.
I got 2 undergrad degrees from Germany and the United Kingdom, and also an MBA here in the US. On the professional side, I have really focused my career on product management over the last 10 years or so before joining the Graph. I've been in the commercial fleet automotive industry, where I have worked a lot with IT solutions and IT products, have gained sort of a good understanding there, and really enjoyed to engage in all different business and operational aspects. That includes processes, sales, marketing, pricing, product training, IT development, billing, and quality as part of being a product manager. And that aspect was really something that excited me the most, to be able to engage in so many different areas of the business. And it really enabled me to get a better understanding how different stakeholders think about your own product, part that they're focused on, the pain points that they experience, and how stakeholders oftentimes look at the same problem from very different point of views, where it becomes your job to bring everyone together, because everyone plays an important part in the product or service delivery. You are also inherently looked as a leader for your product by others in your organization. And that has been something that's been a very unique experience for me. My old boss lifted me into the product manager role early on in my career, at a time where my leadership skills were still rough around the edges, and where I've gone through a lot of learning experience myself. And one of the things that my boss really honed in on is an organizational effectiveness equation that he determined as quality times acceptance equals how effective you can be in your organization. And that is something that really stuck with me for a long time and has sort of guided my own personal and professional development. The quality aspect is something that is self-explanatory. You have to know what you're talking about. You have to know the product features, the processes, in order to be an effective contributor. But the acceptance piece is something that I've really focused a lot on over the last 10 years. And early on, it was an area that I did not excel at. Oftentimes, my boss had to pull me into the office, and one time he said, look, you're hardly ever wrong, but that doesn't make you always right. And what he meant by that is, only because you might have superior knowledge on facts and data, if you don't introduce that into a discussion where others can hear you, then you are severely diminishing your ability to deliver organizational goals. At the same time, I've also experienced that, throughout my career, the acceptance piece in centralized organization is only really half true, because there are a lot of politics going on and people can pull ranks in order to make people do things. The key message that my boss always tried to tell me was that that's not what you want to do. Pulling ranks is the cheapest form of leadership, and it doesn't create an effective leader.
When did you first become aware of crypto?
Probably early 2020 is when I really dove deeper into it. Looking at it from an investment background, I wanted to better understand what are the opportunities here in this space. And so that's where I probably spent a lot of time early on just understanding what is blockchain and what it is about. And that was a process in itself. I have a non-technical background, so that wasn't an easy, subject to digest for me. And as I moved along, I then looked at projects more specifically to try to understand, okay, what is the value proposition? With my product management background, that's where my mind naturally migrates to. How do you create value? What is your use case? And that too was a journey before I had arrived at the Graph.
So what did you see then? You originally came into crypto from this perspective of looking at it as an investment opportunity, but you must have seen something else because you've made a transition into working in the space. So what did you see?
Well, first, when I came across the Graph, this was a protocol like none other, where I was able to really connect the dots. It was like the penny dropped for me. And it became something that got me instantly intrigued in wanting to engage. And again, initially it was from an investment perspective. So I joined many others when the Graph launched mainnet in December last year. And what happened after that was something that I didn't necessarily anticipate. And that was me engaging in the Graph community and everything else that followed.
Well, as you referenced there, you've made a move outside of crypto into working inside crypto. And I'd like to know what your experience has been. What would be your advice to others who are also outside of crypto and trying to figure out if they should make that move?
Look at it as a process and a journey. I think when you first come into the Graph community and ecosystem, it might feel a bit overwhelming from the perspective that there's so many things going on, so many different channels that we are communicating and collaborating in, so many different subjects that we cover in so many different discussions. And the Graph is a very interesting project, but it is also one of the more complex projects that are out there in the Web3 ecosystem. So I think it is important to zoom out many times in the beginning and to recall that the Graph is like Google of Web3, and really starting to digest individual pieces of the protocol, whether it's delegation, indexing, curation, tackle them at one piece at a time. Give yourself time. Don't become frustrated. It is a learning experience. And if you don't have a technical background like myself, it does take some time, and that's perfectly fine.
So if we put on that product manager training that you have extensive history in, and we apply it to the Graph and what you saw, you've already mentioned concepts like value proposition, market, consumer. How then would you explain in that product manager perspective, the Graph and what makes it special?
The Graph, in many ways, is more than just a product. When you look at what the Graph delivers to other dApps, it certainly has a product delivery function. But once you look more of inside the Graph in terms of how we deliver it, you do see, in fact, an entire ecosystem. And when you look at all the different parameters as you engage in sort of deeper discussions, you start to understand how everything correlates and how all of that is important in the product delivery. And it happens in this ecosystem. That to me is the fascinating part about it. The most fascinating part is the decentralized nature of it.
Well, let's double click on that. So that comes up occasionally on the podcast, either subtly or directly, but a lot of guests really put an emphasis on decentralization. So why is that such an important topic for you?
For that, I probably have to go back a few years, and it goes back to my experiences I've had in the centralized world. I have enjoyed, a healthy career, in the past, and that also got me exposed to more political sort of dynamics, and also where I see people being in abuse of power, where people are abusing power, and where reasoning might not always be the winner of a discussion. I have seen ethical abuse happening firsthand in my career, and I've also spoken up to that in the past. And in one instance, a few years back, it got me fired. And that was an experience that really had a big impact on everything else that I've done since. For a number of years, I've been reflecting on that situation where you feel powerless in response to what has happened to you. And the idea, what we've seen emerging over the last few years, fewer and fewer people get into more and more power. Having that firsthand experience, being on the other end of that, is something that I wanted to somehow address and engage in. The way I did that in the job was through empowerment. I wanted to become more active in providing my employees with an opportunity to take decisions in their own hand and be empowered to do so. It has a bit of a satisfying element to know that you are, a leader that others look up to, and go to for decisions. But in the end, what is even more satisfying is if you can pass on knowledge and decision-making power to people that are closest to the process. And that is something that I have enjoyed, and in many ways plays into the concept of decentralization, because I have tried to actively engage to flatten the hierarchy, that I become less of a factor as a leader, but rather put the decision-making power into the hands of those who own the processes. So when I engaged in the graph and saw this decentralized nature, where I could literally walk in from nowhere and engage in protocol and governance discussions and influence decision-making, just like everyone else can. To me, that was an extremely powerful experience. And that is, I think, what has drawn me the most to the graph.
Well, I think you make some really interesting points there. And I think the one I'd like to come back to and just ask a follow-up is this relationship between decentralization, which I agree with you is so important. And I think you articulated why it is in a very helpful way. But decentralization also comes with a lot of personal responsibility. Well, how would you think through that balance of advocating for decentralization, but also encouraging people to take personal responsibility and contribute?
Yeah, decentralization requires people to take initiative. And I have also learned, going back to the idea of empowerment, that some people love it and others don't. And that is fine. I think the graph as a protocol and ecosystem and Web3 overall is for people that love to take initiative, take destiny in their own hand and contribute in positive and meaningful ways. I don't think you find many job descriptions out there in Web3 that tell you exactly what it is that you are doing, where you have a bullet point description that defines your scope of responsibility very neatly. It's an entrepreneurial sort of environment, and it certainly invites and incentivizes those that want to take initiative. And I think that's a key ingredient for everyone wanting to engage in Web3.
So I want to talk a little bit more about your personal engagement with the Graph community. Before you took this formal role at the Graph Foundation, how were you first getting involved in interacting with the Graph community?
I started out in the Delegator community, and that's also where I've engaged the most in the first few months. I was with the Graphonnauts and was an admin there. And I really engaged in educating others that came to the project with a similar background as myself to help explaining how the protocol and ecosystem works. And that is a part that I truly enjoyed. It kind of came natural to me because as a product manager in the past, that was a critical role that I performed as well. And from the Graphonnauts, I then progressed to engage in the network, more broadly in governance discussions, in different forums and Discord. I wanted to get deeper into the weeds. That's what really drove my engagement at the Graph.
For listeners that aren't familiar with who or what the Graphonnauts are, do you mind just taking a second there and telling people what the Graphonnauts is?
The Graphonnauts organize themselves in a Telegram chat called the Graphonnauts, and they focus really on helping to educate delegators that many times, like myself, come in with a non-technical background to help them understand how the graph works, but also how the delegation process works, how to select indexers. They have created an indexer review page that they have on their own website, and that is helpful for delegators to understand how to select indexers from just a quantitative view, and at the same time raising the importance of also engaging with indexers as they make delegation decisions. As we've heard from other speakers before, it is important to understand who you delegate to, who the indexer is. Personal relationships definitely help, also giving you some peace of mind and confidence that you make the right delegation decisions.
Well, you and I first met in the Graphonnauts community when you weren't at the Graph Foundation, and I've met other members of the Graphonnauts team, and I really want to encourage listeners that want to learn more about them and some of the resources they make available to check it out. The Graphonnauts on Telegram. There's a lot of helpful voices there and a lot of support if you need it. So Oliver, turning our attention then to your work at the Graph Foundation, what's your current role at the foundation?
I'm an ecosystem manager with focus on governance. So my role really is, around ecosystem engagement. And as I said before, the job description at the Graph doesn't come in a neat form. You engage in a number of different ways. Certainly curation has been a focus area for myself since we've launched Curation about a month ago. And, really helping that community along to express, their experience in a constructive way so that it can flow into governance discussions that are aimed to improve the curator experience. And that is a key area that I'm engaged in to facilitate the discussions and help moving things along.
The GRTIQ podcast is made possible by a generous grant from the Graph Foundation. The Graph Grants program provides support for protocol infrastructure, tooling, dApps, subgraphs, and community building efforts. Learn more at thegraph.foundation. That's thegraph.foundation.
Hi, this is GRTIQ. Each week we get to meet a new member of the Graph community and ecosystem. The goal here is to take listeners inside the Graph by telling the stories and sharing the insights of those helping to build it. Please consider supporting this project by leaving a review wherever you listen to the GRTIQ podcast or by sharing episodes on social media. And don't forget to visit grtiq.com/podcast for detailed show notes. That's grtiq.com/podcast. Thanks for listening.
Thank you for your support.
Roger that.
Well, I I want to come back to that piece then about governance then. Some listeners may not be familiar with the role that governance plays in protocols like the graph, but if you had to describe what is meant by governance, how would you do that?
One way to look at it is that decision making at the graph is decentralized. And when you think about a job that you have in a centralized world, oftentimes you see decision making going up the hierarchy and coming also back down. When you are in a decentralized network like we are at the graph, we are looking to get the community involved as much as we can in order to arrive at decisions that we mutually agree on. And that's where the governance process kicks in. And what I just described is the off-chain governance process, right? When we talk about graph improvement proposals, to the protocol, etc. There are also on-chain governance parameters that we have. And part of how we're looking at on-chain versus off-chain is, as much as we can by default, we want to govern the protocol by on-chain parameters, as it minimizes sort of the single point of error, which is the human. Humans have proven not to be the most efficient decision makers in the past, and we want to use on-chain protocol parameters as much as we can for governance.
One thing that delegators either don't understand or take full advantage of is that if you own GRT, you can participate in governance in these types of initiatives. Would you mind just taking a moment and just describing how that process actually works, how a delegator could actually participate alongside you and others that are interested in governance?
One thing to look out for, first of all, is our forum that we have. And that's where governance discussions take place. And as we are gaining momentum for certain proposals, then you will see what we call GIPs emerging, which stands for Graph Improvement Proposals. As we march along in our discussions, we will then reach a point where we are looking to have the community to vote on proposals. And that comes in the form of snapshot voting. And when we do these votes, we also then look at the background of each voter, whether they are an indexer, delegator, curator, or simply a holder. And the way we currently weigh the voting is that network participants, such as indexers and delegators, get higher weighting in the vote than just a regular GRT holder who's not participating in the network. Naturally, the reasons for that are twofold. One, we want to incentivize engagement in the network. And B, is also, I think, fairly accurate to say that those who are invested in the network also have a higher interest in protocol decisions and voting.
Well, you bring up the Graph Forum, and in the context of governance, you recently published a post in the forum on this topic of decentralization and a concern that's kind of cropped up over time about making sure that stake remains decentralized. And I'm going to do my best to describe that. And then I'd like for you, if you don't mind, to tell us a little bit more about the post and some of the questions you raised. But the concern is that if you have a protocol like the Graph, where you have indexers that are having delegator stake GRT to, you might run into a decentralization issue if only one or two of the indexers receive all the stake and a whole bunch of other indexers don't. And so you want to, I guess, theoretically, if decentralization is important, you want to make sure that the staking of GRT happens evenly across indexers. Did I summarize your post well? And what other things do you think are important to hit on there?
Yeah, and it's for those reasons that you've mentioned, it is important to for the security of the network. The more indexers that we have participating in the network as indexers, the more secure the network becomes, and that also extends to the stake. And besides the security element, it also has economic impacts. And I've mentioned that in the post as well. Interesting dynamic that we've been seeing ever since Curation launched is that when a large indexer moves their stake around and allocates to a subgraph heavily, it can change the dynamics for a smaller indexer who's already on it quite drastically, even to the point where they might have to reverse their allocation decisions and may have to go elsewhere. these are just normal behaviors that indexers do. There's nothing malicious about, a large indexer doing something like that. And it creates problems not just for small indexers, but for large indexers alike. We have a lot of great indexers, and there is awareness with large indexers, around, these dynamics too. And from what I glean is that they're not necessarily happy with those types of dynamics. So, they too have an interest in terms of how can we become more decentralized. What I've posted in the forum is really future oriented. What I want the community encouraged thinking about is, as we get more stake, into our network through new delegations, how can we help for those delegators to make delegation decisions with decentralization more in mind? That's a discussion that I'd like to stimulate, and I look forward to the discussions with the community.
Well, I really want to encourage listeners to go back and read that post, because I think it does a couple things. Number one, I think it really highlights an important issue that's top of mind for a lot of people participating in the graph. And number two, I really think it's a very strong template for anyone that wants to go into the forum and write a proposal or create a post. It's well researched, it's smart, it's objective, and it is intended to create a lot of discussion. So for those two reasons, I would really encourage listeners to go and check it out. In addition to this post and working on governance initiatives, you and I have started working a little bit more closely because you are involved with an initiative called Community Talk. And so I want to take a minute here and give you the opportunity. What is Community Talk? What's the objective with it? And who do you want to have participate?
So we love for everyone to participate. That's, I think, the most important part. What we have arrived at, I think, with what used to be the town hall meeting in the past is that we had too many things to talk about to be able to squeeze all of that into 1 hour. So we have broken out the core devs meeting and the community talk. So the core devs meeting typically takes place the first week of a month, and the community talk typically takes place third week of the month. In the core devs team meeting, we focus on protocol and governance discussions that are more technical in nature. And in the community talk, we focus on sort of like the news of the graph. We want to provide the community with broad-based updates on everything that is relevant around the community and the ecosystem. We want to spend a little bit more time to be able to provide more insights into specific topics, whether it's indexing, whether it's delegating, whether it's curating, that we have the opportunity as a community to learn together. We also have, in addition to the news, we also want to dive deeper into specific topics and segments that could be reflecting on an announcement or a release that we've made recently. And that could be an educational segment where we all have the ability to gain more insight into specific parts of the protocol or ecosystem. We also want, with community talk, the community to engage more. So it's something that we're experimenting with currently. And the goal here is to hear more directly in the moment from other members of the community, on questions that they might have, or also if you are, say, like a grantee, give us a presentation on a specific topic that you've just completed your grant for example. I look at it in a way also as a way for community members to introduce themselves. Oftentimes, we only communicate in social forums, on Telegram, and Discord. We don't have discussions. We don't hear the voices of others. So it is an opportunity for other members in the community to speak up and to give themselves essentially a platform to introduce themselves. So if you look, for example, at our first community talk, we had James and Derek part of the discussions, and they presented their feedback and insights of curator experience. And I think it was a great way for them to not only bring us deeper into that subject and help us understand it better, but it also helped us, getting to know them. And I think that is an important part of what we want to accomplish with community talk as well.
So for any listener that's non-technical and doesn't necessarily want to get lost in the weeds of what the graph is, community talk is an incredible forum where you can go and join and meet like-minded people, but also get a very nice, non-technical, highly education-oriented introduction to the graph and important topics within the community. At the time of this recording, Oliver, how often is Community Talk taking place, and how can listeners find it and participate?
You can participate by following any of the links that we share in Discord. We will also share it on Twitter beforehand, as well as in the forum. And we are going to have it once a month on typically every third week of the month.
Well, Oliver, I think listeners will be very intrigued by your evolution at the Graph, starting off as a delegator new to crypto, and then now holding a more formal position with the Graph Foundation. Along that journey, I'd be curious to know, what have you learned about the Graph community?
A number of things. I think, ever since I've joined the foundation, it sort of accelerated, my exposure to other members in the community as well. And that is probably the part that I am most impressed with. It's whether we're talking indexers, core devs, other foundation members, there's just so much talent in there and so much dedication to the Graph. It is amazing to see, and it's amazing to be part of that process. Another thing that I think is worth highlighting, which we as a community as a whole have, evolved into, I think, is maturity. I'm thinking back to GIP2 discussions we've had in March on something that there was disagreement on and how all that unfolded. And it was really something that impacted many members in the community in a negative way. And today I'm looking at, for example, the Curation launch, and there's feedback that we're getting also from the curator community. And the way we are walking through that process of identifying certain pain points, coming up with ideas, providing that back to the community, it is night and day to what we had experienced in GIP2. It is highly productive, highly collaborative, and you can get a sense of a true community feel. And it's just so great to see that progression. It's something that I think everyone in the Graph community can be proud to be part of.
For those that have followed the podcast, they know that I've interviewed other members of the Graph Foundation. I've interviewed Eva Baylin, and I interviewed Reem, and now I'm interviewing you, Oliver. I want to give you the opportunity to describe what the Graph Foundation is and the team that's working there, to give listeners a better sense of what this entity is and what its role is within the community.
In my view, the best way to look at the Graph Foundation is that we are trying to facilitate progress. A big part is progressive decentralization, but also to facilitate, the connectivity within the community, bring people together, making sure everyone has a voice, that we identify areas that may be in need of support, and to really focus on growth of our ecosystem. I think at a high level, that's how I would describe the foundation, really trying to put our best effort into helping the growth of the ecosystem.
Hi, this is Oliver Zerhusen, Ecosystem Manager with the Graph Foundation. If my conversation with the GRTIQ podcast has been helpful to you, then please consider supporting future episodes by becoming a subscriber. Visit grtiq.com/podcast for more information. That's grtiq.com/podcast. Thanks for listening.
GRTIQ
Podcast.
Another question about your work at the foundation I'd like to ask you is, are there any common misunderstandings or questions that you seem to come across more than others that you would like to take the opportunity and address maybe to a broader audience here on the podcast?
One of the things I feel I hear about, and it goes back to decentralization, is when people might point, with an inquiry or pain point that they express to the Graph as an entity. Why is the Graph doing this? Why did we decide that? What is the Graph team doing? And I think Yaniv described it earlier this year. The Graph is not an organization itself. The Graph is all of us. And that is something that we also want to promote. We live in a decentralized world. When you see the foundation engaged, it might just be because we see just an opportunity where there is a gap. There's something that we need to engage in order to move things along. It's not always because this is what we want, but it's just because that there is a need for it. And I encourage everyone, to step up and to take initiative. This is how I came about in this community as well. Everyone who wants to engage is welcome, to engage, whether it is for protocol discussions, governance decisions. And, that is something that I will continue to encourage, people in the community.
Well, you've referenced this a couple times in some of your prior answers, but I want to come back and ask you about curation. Obviously, the launch of Curation was a huge deal for the Graph community, and I think we're still learning things about that process, but certainly an important step towards full decentralization. What are your thoughts and perspectives on the rollout of Curation services and some of the things that you've seen happening?
First of all, I think we've seen an amazing curator community emerging very quickly with a lot of talented folks that have come out and really have taken the lead on many of the curator experience enhancement discussions. So that to me is the biggest positive thing and something that excites me to see having emerged. And I think we are in the process of really understanding of what is the curator's role within the protocol. And there are a lot of healthy discussions going on in that area right now. And also discussions on how do we get from the transition period that we are in right now to something that we would consider more steady state, and how can we help make that happen. So there are a lot of ideas being shared right now within the community, and I look forward to help structuring those ideas to maybe specific proposals for the governance process.
As I've thought through the different stakeholder roles within the Graph community, I've always kind of thought that the delegator role could be somebody who's non-technical but wants to participate in the community and take an active role in helping secure the network. I've seen the role of an indexer more technical, more of a DevOps type of situation where you've got to have some hardware and some technical chops to pull it off. This curation role seems to me to be more in line with that of an indexer than a delegator. How do you think through that?
Yeah, yes and no. I think that from a sort of an expertise perspective, if you say that part of the curator's job is to go through the code and see, what is the quality of that code, then yeah, you are more on the technical side. But I think there is something non-technical about it, where it's really about identifying sort of like basic things about a subgraph as it relates to, is it connected to the DApp? What is the expected volume and what sort of revenue do we project to see? To me, that is sort of a core part of a curator's job description. And I don't think that you necessarily need a technical background for that. So I do believe that, delegators currently thinking about curation, I think that that door is very much open, but it's certainly coming with more risks than delegation. So to anyone who doesn't know curation at this point in time, I highly encourage to first read up on how curation works, the risks that occur on the bonding curve, the potential gains as well as losses that you can have there. That is really important to understand. To that extent, curation takes a little bit more time to pick up before I would recommend engaging in that role.
Well, now comes the part of the podcast where I'd like to ask you some definitional questions or how you think through different concepts. Part of the reason I like to ask these questions is because I think it's so helpful when someone has a non-technical background and has evolved and grown within the community. They can help listeners with their own perspective of these really important concepts, understand them, and feel more confident about engaging in the community. So I want to start with how you think through or would describe the graph to a non-technical person.
The Google of blockchain is certainly, a very relevant phrase, even though it does not exactly match up. So for a non-technical person to understand, what the graph does for Web3, it has that similar sort of impact like Google has as well, in that blockchain needs indexing protocols in order to access and index data, efficiently. And that is the role that graph plays.
Well, another concept I bring up all the time on the podcast is this idea of what a subgraph is. And again, a very central component of what the graph does and the technology in the protocol. So how then do you think about what a subgraph is?
Yeah, you have received many good explanations for what a subgraph is, including a restaurant example, which I really love because my passion is with cooking. But I want to go at it from a Web 2 developer's point of view. I've worked with a ton of Web 2 developers in the past. Maybe some of them are listening. So let me explain it from their point of view. I think for a Web 2 developer, subgraphs are like the door that gets you from Web 2 to Web 3. If you are an IT developer, a database engineer, and you don't know where to start exploring what Web 3 can offer you, subgraph development can be that starting point. We have a lot of educational content available at the Graph to get you up to speed on coding and great community support as well. You can start by doing this part-time to find out if that is something that excites you, subgraph development. And if it does, the Graph provides you with a framework to create your own job. You can build your reputation as a subgraph dev within the Web3 space. You can offer these services to other dApps who are in need for subgraphs and can get compensated for building them. We have some upcoming protocol enhancements that are likely to come, I believe, which will also further support that type of business model. Deploy and Signal provides the opportunity for further incentives by engaging as a curator in projects that you strongly believe in by getting first on the bonding curve. Another one is change of ownership, which will allow transferring subgraph ownership back to the dApp once the subgraph development is complete and your work is done. I think this is an amazing opportunity for many Web 2 devs that are interested in Web 3 and an area that I would anticipate to see a lot of growth in the coming weeks and months.
Well, another question I like to ask guests is how they think about this idea of what Web3 is. I think it's a buzzword. It gets used a lot, but not everybody can wrap their minds around what Web3 is. So I'd like to ask you, how do you define or think about what Web3 is?
I truly believe Web3 is the future. And one key reason for that is I feel that just the way blockchains and decentralized protocols are designed is much more in line with how generation Y and G just thinks about life in general. When I just look at my last 2 years professional business experience that I've had prior to joining the Graph, I have worked with a lot of emerging leaders, from those generations, and I have seen a very different mindset to the traditional views of transparency in particular. There is so much more of a push to be open with your information, to share it in an effort to arrive at better solutions and results. Whereas traditionally it might have been viewed as a trade secret, these days it's just being demanded more to be made available. And that is very much in line with how Web3 is being designed, the protocols that you see. And that is something I believe more and more people over time will identify with, and that the adoption will just occur naturally.
Well, as somebody started off with an investment interest in crypto and kind of came into the Graph, and now you're at the Graph Foundation and you're a very important and well-respected voice within the Graph community, I'd be curious what your advice is now for people that are going about selecting an indexer, because I'm sure, just like me, the way you approach that question early on versus how you would approach that now is entirely different. So what's your advice for delegators when selecting an indexer?
It is a great question, and one that I know it has been answered. And you want to go back to the idea of know your indexer, right? That is something that we have a regular initiative around. At the forum, we already have over 15 indexers that have been presented and with a profile and deeper Q&As that allow you to get to know that indexer better. I personally feel that interacting with indexers, and that doesn't necessarily mean direct interaction, but just observing conversations that indexers have, gives me a lot of information about sort of like, the personality and the character of an indexer. And see, I go down to that level where I feel this is an indexer that I feel personally connected to it. That is an indexer that is helping other indexers. That is an indexer that knows a lot, who is a net contributor, in discussions on a frequent basis. That gives me confidence in that indexer knows what they're doing very well. And that is something that you can follow on Discord. There are many channels where indexers are very actively engaged in conversations. The indexer channel, the indexer to delegator channel as well. Those are typically the ones where you see them the most interacting with one another. And that's just something I would recommend. Try to find that personal connection with indexers.
Oliver, with everything you've learned about the graph community, and the potential of this project, if you could go back in time and tell yourself in 2020 when you were first getting acquainted with crypto, something about the graph, what do you think the most important thing you would want to tell your past self that you know now?
Get engaged earlier and heavier. I think that for me, it might have taken a little bit of time to truly understand the potential of what the graph can deliver. And in many ways, we're all still learning what the graph can do. I think most recently we've had a tweet that was suggesting that a blockchain can be created in a subgraph. So I think it is just amazing to see the type of potential and innovation that the graph actually creates. And it is much more than just an indexing protocol. That is certainly true. And I'm excited for the future and to see much more innovation to come about that the graph will deliver on.
Well, let's double click on that as our final question here. But what is your long-term vision for the graph?
In the long run, I see the graph being sort of a key component for the infrastructure of Web3. I also think that we have the opportunity with the graph to become the blueprint for many other dApps to come. That's part of what I see our role in Web3, because we have a very mature and active community. We are committed to decentralization and have already a very advanced protocol design that others can learn from. So governance is something that's near and dear to my heart. And when we're talking about decentralized organizational structures, when we're talking about DAOs, there's a lot more, I think, that we will see happening in terms of discussions and what we are going to implement. And with Graph being a complex protocol, I think other dApps out there are looking at the Graph to see what we are doing and how successful we are. And I think that's an exciting part of the process. And that is something that I look very much forward to be part of the process.
Well, Oliver, thank you so much for your time. And I really appreciate all the great work you're doing at the Graph Foundation and the opportunity to work with you and other great people on Community Talk. So if people want to learn more about your work and the work at the foundation, what's the best way to follow it?
A number of ways. You can reach me via Discord as Oliver Z, as well as Telegram channel in the official chat, the Graph Forum, where I'm very actively engaged in many different discussions, and also Twitter, where you can reach me at Oliver Zerhusen.
This has been a production of the GRT IQ podcast. For more information, including detailed show notes, visit grtiq.com/podcast. That's grtiq.com/podcast.
Please consider contributing to this project and helping build the community by subscribing and leaving a review.
GRTIQ.